Nestled in the shadow of the rugged mountains, the small town of Frostwood was a place where time seemed to stand still. The air was crisp, the streets blanketed in snow, and the evergreens stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with frost. It was a town where everyone knew everyone, where life moved at a slower pace, and where the bonds of community ran deep. But on this particular day, the town was cloaked in sorrow. The townsfolk had gathered at the edge of the forest, where a freshly dug grave stood as a stark reminder of the fragility of life. The man they had come to mourn was Jack Harper, a beloved husband, father, and friend. Jack had been a man of the mountains, a ranger who had dedicated his life to protecting the wilderness and its creatures. His sudden death in a hiking accident had left the town reeling, and none more so than his wife Clara. Clara stood by the grave, her face pale and her eyes red from days of crying. She clutched a single white rose in her hands, her fingers trembling as the cold wind bit at her skin. The pastor's words washed over her, but she couldn't focus on them. All she could think about was the empty space beside her, where Jack should have been standing. As the pastor finished his eulogy and the mourners began to disperse, a hush fell over the crowd. From the edge of the forest, a lone wolf emerged, its silver-gray fur glistening in the pale winter light. The animal moved with a quiet grace, its piercing blue eyes fixed on Clara. The townsfolk froze, their breath visible in the cold air. Wolves were not uncommon in the mountains, but they rarely ventured so close to humans. Yet this wolf showed no fear. It walked steadily toward the grave, its head held high, and came to a stop just a few feet away from Clara. Clara's heart raced as she stared into the wolf's eyes. There was something familiar about the animal, something that stirred a deep, aching pain in her chest. The wolf tilted its head as if studying her, and then let out a soft, mournful howl that echoed through the valley. The sound sent shivers down Clara's spine. It was a sound of grief, of longing, a sound that mirrored the ache in her own heart. The wolf refused to leave. It stayed by the grave, its presence both unsettling and comforting. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of the animal. Some saw it as a bad omen, while others believed it was a sign from the wilderness Jack had loved so much. For Clara, the wolf's presence was a mystery she couldn't ignore. She felt drawn to the animal in a way she couldn't explain. Over the next few days, she began to visit the grave daily, and each time, the wolf was there, waiting for her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and the sky turned shades of pink and gold, Clara sat by the grave, her fingers tracing the letters on Jack's headstone. The wolf lay nearby, its head resting on its paws. "Why are you here?" Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The wolf lifted its head and met her gaze. In that moment, Clara felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. She remembered the stories Jack used to tell her, stories of the wolves he had encountered in the mountains, of their intelligence and loyalty, of the deep bond they shared with their pack. And then it hit her. Clara's hands trembled as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It was a picture of Jack, taken years ago during one of his expeditions. In the photo, he was kneeling beside a wolf with silver-gray fur and piercing blue eyes. The same wolf that now sat by his grave. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she realized the truth. This wolf wasn't just a random animal. It was Jack's wolf, a creature he had saved and bonded with during his time in the wilderness. The wolf had come to say goodbye, just as Clara had. The wolf stayed by the grave for weeks, its presence a silent tribute to the man who had been its friend. Clara visited every day, finding solace in the animal's quiet companionship. She began to share her memories of Jack with the wolf, her words carrying on the wind as the snow fell softly around them. One morning, Clara arrived at the grave to find the wolf gone. At first, she felt a pang of loss, but then she noticed something in the snow, a single paw print leading back into the forest. Clara smiled through her tears. The wolf had said its goodbye, and now it was time for her to do the same. As the seasons changed and the snow began to melt, Clara found herself healing. She knew Jack would always be with her, in the mountains he loved and in the memories they had shared. And though the wolf was gone, Its presence had left an indelible mark on her heart. Years later, Clara would tell the story of the wolf at her husband's funeral, a story of love, loss, and the unexpected connections that bind us all. And every time she looked at the mountains, she would remember the wolf's mournful howl and the bond it had shared with the man she loved. The days turned into weeks, and the wolf remained a constant presence by Jack's grave. Clara found herself drawn to the animal in ways she couldn't fully explain. Each morning, she would bundle up in her thickest coat, scarf, and gloves and make the trek to the edge of the forest. She brought food for the wolf, fresh meat from the butcher, leftovers from her own meals. And though the wolf rarely ate in her presence, it always acknowledged her with a soft, almost imperceptible nod. The townsfolk began to notice the bond forming between Clara and the wolf. At first they were wary, whispering among themselves about the strange companionship. But as time went on, they came to accept it, even admire it. The wolf became a symbol of Jack's enduring spirit, a reminder of the love he had for the wilderness and the creatures that called it home. One particularly cold morning, Clara arrived at the grave to find the wolf lying on the snow-covered ground, its body curled tightly to conserve warmth. She knelt beside it, her breath forming small clouds in the air. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Why won't you leave?" The wolf lifted its head and looked at her, its blue eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. In that moment, Clara felt a connection so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She reached out a trembling hand, and to her surprise, the wolf didn't pull away. It allowed her to touch its fur, the warmth of its body seeping through her gloves. "You miss him too, don't you?" she whispered. The wolf let out a soft whine, a sound so full of sorrow that Clara's heart ached. She sat down in the snow beside the animal, her back against the cold stone of Jack's headstone, and began to talk. She told the wolf about her life with Jack, how they had met, fallen in love, and built a life together in Frostwood. She spoke of his kindness, his laughter, his unwavering dedication to the mountains. And as she talked, the wolf listened, its eyes never leaving her face. One evening, as Clara prepared to leave the grave, she noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees and sending snow swirling through the air. She knew a storm was coming, and she hesitated, torn between the safety of her warm home and the pull of the wolf's presence. "You should find shelter," she said to the wolf, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It's going to be a bad one." The wolf stood and stretched, its gaze fixed on the forest. For a moment, Clara thought it might leave, but instead it turned and began to walk toward her. She froze, her heart pounding as the animal approached. It stopped just inches away, its breath warm against her face, and then it nudged her gently with its nose. Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "You want me to follow you?" The wolf turned and began to walk toward the forest, its pace slow and deliberate. Clara hesitated for only a moment before following, her boots crunching in the snow. The wind howled around them, the storm growing stronger with each passing minute, but the wolf led her with unwavering confidence. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more dense around them. Clara's legs ached, and her fingers were numb with cold, but she didn't dare stop. She trusted the wolf, though she couldn't explain why. Finally, they reached a small clearing, sheltered by towering evergreens. In the center of the clearing was a cave, its entrance partially hidden by snow. The wolf stopped and looked back at Clara, its eyes filled with a quiet assurance. "Is this where you've been staying?" she asked, her voice trembling. The wolf didn't answer, of course, but it didn't need to. Clara stepped inside the cave, her breath catching as she took in the sight before her. The walls were lined with soft moss, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dry leaves. In one corner, she spotted a pile of bones, remnants of the wolf's meals. But what caught her attention was the small, weathered blanket lying in the center of the cave. It was Jack's blanket. Clara's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, tears streaming down her face. She recognized the blanket immediately. It was the one Jack had always carried with him on his expeditions, the one he had wrapped around her shoulders on their first camping trip together. "You've been keeping it safe," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For him." The wolf let out a soft whine and lay down beside her, its body warm against hers. Clara wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and leaned against the animal, her tears soaking into its fur. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cave, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since Jack's death. The storm lasted for 3 days, trapping Clara and the wolf in the cave. During that time, Clara learned more about the animal than she ever thought possible. She discovered that the wolf was a female, her body scarred from battles fought and survived. She learned that the wolf had a gentle side, often nuzzling Clara's hand or resting her head in her lap. And she realized that the wolf's grief mirrored her own, a deep, unrelenting ache for the man they had both loved. When the storm finally passed, Clara emerged from the cave, the wolf by her side. The forest was blanketed in fresh snow, the air crisp and clean. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of renewal she hadn't felt in months. "Thank you," she said to the wolf, her voice filled with gratitude, "for everything." The wolf looked at her for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the trees. Clara watched her go, a bittersweet ache in her heart. She knew the wolf would return to the wilderness, to the life she had always known, but she also knew that their bond would never be broken. As the months turned into years, Clara found herself healing in ways she never thought possible. She continued to visit Jack's grave, but the pain of his loss became easier to bear. She often thought of the wolf, wondering if she was still out there, roaming the mountains as Jack had once done. One winter morning, as Clara stood by the grave, she heard a familiar sound, a soft, mournful howl that echoed through the valley. She turned, her heart racing, and saw a flash of silver-gray fur in the distance. The wolf had returned. Clara smiled through her tears, knowing that Jack's spirit lived on in the wilderness he had loved so much. And as the wolf's howl faded into the wind, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that love, in all its forms, was eternal.